Alright, we are here today to cover Excel basics and my favorite transactions within Excel. So we're going to jump right to it and not waste any time. Alright, great. So we're going to start with principles of organization. So the principle of organization that I want you to think about is, one, always logically approach your workbook like you're reading a book, so left to right. We want the most general information on the left-hand side and the most specific information and your values on the right-hand side. And the second principle I want you to think about is to organize it in a way where if someone were to open your workbook tomorrow and you weren't there to explain it, they'd be able to walk through it and figure out some of the steps that you put into it, which we'll go over in a minute here. So more on going left to right. So you can see here, the first thing I have here is account. The next is order type, and then so on and so forth until we get to the actual order number that we have here. And then we get more specific with the discount, the date it was created, the ship window, the actual type of product that's on there, the end use, the gender, so on and so forth. And then on the rightmost columns, we have our actual values. Okay. Now, when I talk about opening the workbook in such a way where someone can figure out what you did in this workbook, we're going to talk later about color coding your columns. For example, you can see up here that there's a calculation color. So whenever we add a column that has a calculation involved, we'll color code that so someone can very quickly see that there's something different about this column. And then it also means that we're going to clearly label our tabs here. So you can see we have order data, we have XLOOKUP, which we'll be filling out further in a moment here. And then if we add any other tabs in this workbook, we'll make sure they're clearly labeled. Finally, naming your workbook. You want it to have a clear title and then the date that the data was pulled as well. This isn't just for other people that you might be sharing with, but also for yourself, so you can look back on it and know when your data set was pulled. Okay, I like to start by formatting this as a table, which you can do so by clicking this drop down, and you can go with any color code you like. I just like using the first one here. And then right away, this is going to format our workbook as a table. Now, the benefit of this is when we add pivot tables in a moment, it will automatically defer to the size of the table. So if you add more information later, your pivot table will automatically adjust. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. And when you add in formulas, it will automatically drag down the entire length of the table, so you don't have to click and drag your formula down. The last thing we'll touch on here is whenever you're making a workbook, you always want to think about who the potential audience is and what your outcomes are. So, for example, you might use acronyms internally, but if your customer or your potential audience doesn't know what those acronyms are, you might want to adjust those. So RDD is an acronym that my company uses, but something that might make more sense to someone else is start ship date and end ship date. And that makes up the ship window. Okay, and then there might also be sensitive information on here, like if you're not willing to share payment terms with a certain person that this workbook is going to, you want to make sure that gets removed. So you're always thinking about who the potential audience is, and if you're sending it to someone else, who they might be sending it to. So it might be an internal partner, but if they work closely with a customer and you don't want to share the payment terms or the discount or what have you with them, make sure that's removed. Okay, let's talk about formatting once you actually have this set up as a table. So you can see that we have discount here, but it's in a decimal format. My favorite way to adjust formatting quickly is to use these options here. So you can see one, we have percent style, so we can click the little percent sign. If there's, let's say if one of these was 12.5%, you can increase your decimal points so that you can see what the decimal is on those. Okay. Now let's say this was a date that was formatted as a number. You can click this drop down here and then select short date. If you select long date, it will give you the double clicking to expand it. It'll give you the day, the month, and the year. But for our purposes, we're going to use short date. Okay. Moving over here, we have some dollar values. The quickest way to adjust these is to use this accounting number button. Okay. You could also do the same thing by coming down here, selecting that. Now let's say you wanted to select more than one at a time because there's a bunch of dollar signs here. If you hold Control down and then click on each of these columns, it will allow you to select more than one at a time. And then you can hit your dollar sign. Lastly, if you're talking just units or something that doesn't have a dollar sign in front of it, but you want it separated with a comma, you can hit this comma button and it will automatically adjust for you. Okay. If you don't want commas, my favorite option is to just do general, or you could do number as well. Oops. But I like having the commas, so I'm going to select that as my option for all of the ones that would have a comma. Okay. Now let's quickly touch on some of the most simple formulas that we'll use. So we'll start with removing duplicates. Okay, so I just pasted these onto its own tab so we can work with it here. Now to remove duplicates, like you can see, if we apply a filter by clicking this filter drop down, or Control-Shift-L is a shortcut to apply your filter, you can see that we have three options here. Now if you select data and then select remove duplicates, it will then show you that you just have three options here. Now let's say you only wanted to see the first letter of each one of these. If you select do equal sign and then type in left, you can then click here, click on your cell that you want to pull information from, and then comma and the number of characters over that you'd like to select. You can then drag that down, and then you can see, all right, if you only wanted to see the first letter of each of these, that'd be a way to do this. Now for my company's products, we use a 7-digit style number is what we call it, and then a 3-digit color code, and it'll look something like this. Okay, so that'd be an example of a style number, a dash, and a color code. Now the left, right, and middle formulas come in handy for when you want to separate things out. So let's say you have the 7-digit style number and the 3-digit color code, and you want to separate those out. You want them in different cells. You want just the style numbers in one cell and just the color code in another cell. You can isolate your style number by selecting the cell and then comma, same thing as before, the number of characters from left to right that we want isolated. In this instance, we want the first 7, so I'm going to select 7. Now, let's imagine that we want just the color code in one cell. If you do select right, this is the same type of formula, except now it counts from right to left the number of characters that you are isolating. So in this instance, we'll select the cell we're taking data from. We will put a comma, and then we're moving over 3 characters. Now we'll isolate the color code. So we can call this article, style, color code. Now, let's say you want to isolate something that stands in the middle. In this instance, what's in the middle is the little dash sign. So if we were to isolate that, we could do a middle formula, which has just one more step, which is you select the cell you're isolating, then you do the number of characters over that you want to start from. In this instance, it would be, we'll start on the 8th character, and we just want to select one of those characters. Okay, and that's the dash. Now, let's imagine for a moment that you had a whole row of style numbers, a whole row of color codes, and you wanted to combine them together so that you could have your article number because you didn't already have this listed. That's when you can do something called a concatenation, which is a super handy formula where you can push values together into one cell. And it's super simple. Once you type in equals concatenate, you select the cell you want to combine. So in this case, we want to combine the style, the dash, and the color code. And now we'll combine those all for us. Okay. Another thing that I want to touch on briefly is leading zeros. So sometimes you might have a whole row of order numbers, and in a particular software it needs 10 digits. So let's grab a bunch of order numbers from here. And by the way, to scroll all the way down, I click the top cell, and then I hold Control Shift, and I hit my down arrow key to copy all the way down to the bottom. just like before, just to reduce any duplicate values, I'm going to select remove duplicates. I'm just going to do it from the sales doc column. And now we only have the unique values. Okay. So in this instance, let's count how many numbers we have. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. So we have 9 numbers here. Let's imagine that for a particular software, you need a 10-digit number in order to be able to you need a 10-digit number to actually input these order numbers and have it spit out whatever information you're looking for. Now, if you just let's play around with this for a second. So if you just typed in this number and then put a 0 in front of it, the 0 disappears. So a way that you can add in a 0 is if you put a comma first and then the 0. Now it registers that 0 and will actually hold it within the cell. Okay. So now you're thinking to yourself, gee, well, am I going to paste in a 0 every single time to get this? Well, we could use something like a concatenate, which we did before. So let's, if we stick a 0 up here, we can do the same formula we just worked on. Just concatenate. Oops. If I select my cell, and then let's see, where are we? J4. Now we have the 0 in front. Now, to drag a formula down, you can click and drag, or you can double click and it will drag all the way down. However, I'm going to show you a trick here, because in this instance, when you drag the formula down, it moves down one cell, and this one is blank. However, if you want to lock in that first number, so if you wanted to lock in K1, if you put a $sign in front of the K and the 1, it will then lock it in so that the J column continues to scroll down, but your formula will continue to reference the one that you just locked in with K1 with the $signs. You can also lock it in. The shortcut for it is F4. Okay, now sometimes, if you have a huge workbook that has a lot of formulas in it, you might want to remove the formula so that it's not taking up as much space and processing power on your workbook. So to do that, you can highlight all your cells that have the formula, Control C to copy, and then Control V to paste. So you just pasted this, and now if you scroll down here, you can see that there's your paste options. Also, if you right click, you have paste options. If you paste these as values instead of as formula, what you get is now, instead of seeing the formulas up here, you now see the actual number. So let's go back just to reiterate that point. So now you can see the formulas in each cell, but if we paste values, we now have just the value with the leading 0 in front. So sometimes, and we'll go over this in the XLOOKUP section, but sometimes this 0 in front can cause problems. So you can see there's these little green triangles up at the top here. That means that your number is stored as a text. You can select convert to number, and that's going to drop off the 0 for you. Now, the fastest way to do this without crashing your computer is to if you wanted to remove all the leading zeros, is to filter this, or highlight the whole column, select text to columns, and then click over, hit finish, and it will remove all of your leading zeros. Okay, now to insert a column, if you have home selected on your top banner and you select insert, it will insert a new column. To delete that column, same one, you would hit this delete button. Now that deletes the whole column. If you wanted to just delete the information in the column but not necessarily the whole, erase the column itself, you would hit the delete key. So let's just to reiterate that point, if you hit delete, it just eliminates the information in there and not the whole column itself. Okay, so let's quickly talk about adding in a formula here. So if we were to, let's call this total ordered units. And since there's a formula in here, we want to be clear with that and label that as a calculation. You can do sum as your formula, or if you just start selecting the cells you want to add together and separate them with a plus sign, you can do that as well. Now, if you were to be subtracting units, you would use a minus sign. If you were to be dividing units, you'd use a slash. If you're multiplying, you'd use a star. Okay? But in this case, we're adding. Now, these are units, so we're going to make sure they show up as such. And then we can call this total ordered dollars. Okay. If you drag this over, you can see that your formula moves over one cell in each case. So that's going to do the trick for us. And now we can populate. Okay. So let's pretend for a moment that we needed to add in a we wanted to do it, pull in information from another workbook into this workbook. So first, in this instance, I'm going to create a unique value. So we're going to call this division, gender, and use. I'm going to concatenate those 3 cells. Now, let's say that each sales rep that my team works with is assigned a specific division, gender, and use. I'm going to pull up another workbook here. Okay, so now we have our division, gender, and use. We have XLOOKUP, and we have the rep number that we want to pull in. Okay, so if, like in this instance, we have a value that is the same on both tabs. We're in 2 different workbooks, but the information that I want to pull into my new workbook is the rep number. Okay. So to do an XLOOKUP, you start with any formula by doing equal sign and then your actual formula, so XLOOKUP. Now it all starts with your lookup value. So this is the common denominator on both spreadsheets. So in this instance, the common denominator that's a unique value is this division, gender, and use concatenation that we have. So I'm going to select that first. Now, look up, you select comma, and then you can see now it moves in bold to this next step, which is lookup array. So if we come over to our tab, our lookup array is going to be the column that has the same common denominator. So in this instance, it's the other tab that has the same concatenation. You select comma, and you can see over here that it moves to return array. And this is the information we want to take from the other workbook and bring into our tab. In this instance, it's rep. Now, at this point, you could hit enter, or you could close your comma, and you'd be all set. One nice thing about XLOOKUP that VLOOKUP did not have is it can show an input if not found. So if you select comma, you can see that in the squared off parentheses it says if not found. So I'm going to say if not found. So if none of these concatenations apply, we'll say no rep. I'll close my comma, hit enter, and now we have all of our reps pulled in here. Okay, now we're going to move on to pivot tables. So start by selecting Insert across the top banner and then Pivot Table. Note, since we designed this workbook as a table, you can see the table range says Table 1. If you didn't have that, it would select the row. It would show the rows and the columns that are being highlighted. It's important to make sure that all of them, if you don't have it formatted as a table, you want to make sure that all of your information is highlighted within the pivot table data. Another problem, if you hit OK and a pop-up comes up, it's usually because one of the columns is blank or not named. So it's important that every column has an actual label. Let's select OK. Now, right away, I'm going to rename this as pivot table. Okay. I always like formatting it the same way, so I'm going to recommend you do the same. So start by right-clicking, select pivot table options. Then select display and classic pivot table. From here, I want you to do design, select subtotals, and show do not show subtotals. I'm going to backspace 1 so you can see what it looks like if you do not remove those. So let's say we bring in account number, we bring in order reason, we can bring in PO. Actually, we won't do that. We'll do sales document type. And you can see that each one of these has its own subtotal. It gets really messy, so I always recommend do not show subtotals, and then you can intentionally right-click and select which columns you actually want a subtotal on instead of having a subtotal for every single one. It depends on the type of data you're pulling, but often it looks nice if you go to report layout and select repeat all lines. Just makes, in some cases, not all, but it'll make it look cleaner if you repeat all lines. Now, the great thing about the pivot table is you have this gigantic data set over here that is over 100,000 lines, but you can take your pivot table and summarize the information in any way you want. So let's go over a couple key principles of the pivot table. First is knowing that you have these 4 quadrants down here that you can put information into. The 2 most common that you're going to use are rows and values. So in your values, you can have things like your total ordered units. Again, you'll have to format these properly. But you can pull in all the information here. So now you have a nice clean summary for the 2 accounts that we're looking at in this instance of what they actually ordered. And we have the different order types that are available, the different order reasons, and if we want to adjust this summary in any way, we can quickly remove rows to make this more precise. Or we could add rows. So let's say we wanted to see this broken down by division, and we didn't care if it was an at once or a futures order, and then we wanted to add in gender, we can do that. Another cool trick is, let's say the accessories team isn't concerned about the gender. You can minimize that by selecting this box here. So if you just wanted to see gender for one of your divisions, you can do that. If you wanted to collapse the entire field, if you right-click on the little box here, expand or collapse, you can select collapse entire field, and that'll collapse all of them. Or if you wanted to do the opposite, you can expand all of them. That way, you're not clicking these one by one if you know that you want to expand all of them. Okay, so you mainly are going to live in this rows and values section, but knowing when to use filters and when to use columns can really enhance your pivot table usage. Now, my recommendation is that you only use columns when you have one value in here. And here's why. So let's say we have this table here, and we wanted to pull in gender as a column. So if we pull gender into a column, you can see now that this table goes from being like a nice summary to one that's just like totally blown out of proportion. We have dozens of columns now. It'd be really hard to look at this as a clean summary. But that's because each gender is now so like for each gender, we have boys, girls, men's, unisex, women's. It's now showing up for each value. But the reason I like to use columns only when I have one value is that if you just have one value in here, now it's a clean table. And sometimes having this number, having the column across the top will be a nicer way to present the data than having it as a second row. Like you can see here, the information is still pretty clear, but if we were to throw this across the top, it just looks like a much tighter and cleaner table. So use columns in my opinion only when you have one value here, and use them to create a nicer looking summary. Now, another thing that you'll notice as you continue your study of pivot tables is that when you bring in dates, They may group themselves automatically. So sometimes when you bring in a date, it'll show up like this. You can ungroup your dates so that you just have the shorthand version. But it's really helpful to know how to group dates. So like, let's say you wanted to provide a summary for these two accounts just by month. Now if you, or let's say quarter. So if you select group, you have the option to group these by month, by quarter, by year. So if I select quarters, I can now have a nice clean summary of the total units, and Excel did that for me. If you wanted to group it by quarters and months, you can do that. You can see, obviously, if you ungroup it, then it's just too much data to be able to comprehend it easily. Okay, last thing we'll talk about here is filters. So let's pretend for a second. So we have rejection code here. Now for my usage, I know that any rejection code that starts with an M for us means that it's miscellaneous. So we don't typically look at that in our reporting. It was done in a way that it's not driven by us or by one of our customers. So if you select filter, up here you can filter those out so that they don't even show up in the table. Now there's also the option where you could filter within the table. So let's say that you wanted to see the label, but you wanted to filter out most of the genders. You can do that so that you can still see the gender while filtering. So you have more than one option to filter things. The last thing we'll touch on is adding a formula. So let's say that you wanted to like for here we have total ordered units. Let's say you want to report on total processing and shipped units. If you select field items and sets and then collect calculated field, you can say, we'll call this total fulfilled units. And just like you were creating any other formula, you can separate these by a plus sign, and then now you can see that it added those together. If you ever want to double check the sum of something quickly, if you highlight these two cells, you can see down the right hand corner that there's a sum down here. So just by spot checking this number, it's the same as this one over here. So we know that the formula is correct. There's last option here is that you can also change the value of your field. So let's say like right now it's showing up as the sum of total fulfilled units. If you click on that and go to value field settings, You could also show this as the percent to the grand total. So that's a way of showing percentages within your pivot table nice and very easily. You could also add in a percentage manually if you wanted to by doing calculated field. So we could say percent fulfilled. Divided by total ordered. Now we have percent fulfilled. Now this is divided by the total ordered, not necessarily to the percent to the grand total, which is what the first one was doing. So two means to the different ends, depending on what you want to look at here. Okay, let me check my notes, see if there's anything else that we missed. Okay, so we'll do a quick if statement, which can be your best friend. Okay. So let's say for a moment that if the ETA of a product is 2 weeks after the start ship date, that we will consider that late to the start ship date. Okay. So if we consider that, then we could do we'll make a column here that says ETA minus our, we'll call it start ship date. We will label this as a calculation. Then we'll put in the formula. Oh, okay. So now we got these all formatted as numbers. Now, we just said that if a product is arriving 2 weeks after the start ship date, we will consider it late. So all these zeros are on time, this 3 is on time, but this 18 and this 111, those are going to be considered late. So we can call this late or on time. Okay. So the way that an if statement works is that it's a form of logic. So if you were to say, it starts with a logic test. So we're going to say, if this cell is greater than or equal to 15, because actually we'll say 14, because we said 2 weeks is going to be considered late. If it is greater than 14, we want it to say late. And if it is not, we will say it is on time. Now we'll automatically drag down, and that way you don't have to, like, for example, another way to get there would be if you applied filters to this, and then you said, all right, show me everything that's greater than 18 or 15 rather, and we'll mark those as late. And then you could select show me everything that is less than 14. We'll mark those as on time. But this is just another way to do that without having to go through all those steps. So if you understand an if statement, you'll be able to do that quickly. There's also ways to layer in an if statement, which is not for a basics video. So that just about covers everything. You can reach out to me if you have any questions, and that will cover it for today. Thanks for your time.